Hello, friends. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the podcast where I sit down and interview other writers. It is called Making It Up for two reasons. One reason being at the end of every episode, we pick a random book from my bookshelves and we make up a short story based on one of the sentences in that book. It's also called Making It Up because, you know what? I kind of make it up as I go along. I do a little bit of research about my guests, enough to have some context about the person I'm talking to. But really, for me, the joy and the interest in creating this podcast is to discover writers that I don't know a lot about and to have conversations almost like I just met them at a cocktail party. So an ability for me to react to what they're saying rather than coming at them with a standard list of questions. And that's actually one of the reasons I started the podcast is I've done a decent amount of interviews myself, having been interviewed, and a lot of podcasters do have a standard list of questions, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But it's almost like you answer the standard question and then they go right to the next question without kind of reacting to or digging into your answer at all. So I didn't want to ask somebody, what famous writers, living or dead, would you want to most have dinner with? That is not this type of podcast. So before I get to today's guest, I just want to mention that my writing company under the name of Unbound Writer is taking off, and we're offering writing retreats in Boulder, Colorado, 2.5-day retreats and one-on-one coaching with myself. And we're soon going to be launching online classes with instructors, both myself and other best-selling writers. So very excited. If you want to learn more about that, just go to unboundwriter.com. So today on the show, I had author Peter Blauner. So Peter is the author of 9 novels, including Slow Motion Riot, which was the winner of the Edgar Award for the best first novel, and The Intruder, which was a New York Times bestseller and a bestseller overseas. Now, The Intruder originally came out in 1996 and it just recently got re-released. So it's kind of having a new life breathed into it. So we talked a lot about that. He also does a lot of work and has done a lot of work over the years within the television industry. So we talked about kind of the differences between collaborative writing in a writer's room for television versus the mostly solitary act of writing a novel. And so he had some really interesting thoughts on that as well. And we spent some time talking about his novel Picture in the Sand, which just came out in paperback the day that we recorded this, and where he got that idea from. It's a fascinating idea. And the amount of research he did is equally fascinating. And the fact that it was a novel that basically took 20 years to complete because it went through so many different iterations over time. And he had the tenacity to say, come hell or high water, this is a good story and it's going to find a home somewhere. So that was really interesting to talk to him about. And at the end, of course, we made up a fantastic short story, kind of that hinged on an author doing research. So folks, I think you're going to like this one. I certainly did. This is my conversation with Peter Blauner. Now, are you holed up in a home office or?
I'm actually at an office in Queens, New York. I'm working for a new television show. My side hustle is I write for TV sometimes, as well as writing my novels. So it's a brand new show that won't be on the air for a while, and doesn't have a name yet, but I'm working with a lot of bright, talented young people, and I'm really excited to see their work before the cameras.
That's cool. Do you have a preference in terms of writing for television versus writing novels?
Well, they're completely different businesses.
Sure they are, yeah.
And television is really a collaborative medium under the best of circumstances, and you get to interact with a lot of smart people who are experienced, and who have a different point of view, and maybe you'll produce something that's very entertaining. Writing a book is a much more intense, intimate experience. It's something I've done since I was 13 years old, and it's a way of connecting with people much more directly, in a much more serious way. That you're communicating from the little box inside your head to the little box inside somebody else's head.
Right.
And if somebody has a problem with the story or the character or the tone or the language, there's no one to hide behind. There's no one to blame.
Right.
But if it works for somebody, there's no better feeling in the world.
Right. It's super rewarding because, right, like you said, it's like they're paying to buy this thing that I just thought up.
Yes.
And it's such a weird feeling. And likewise, even if they hate it, you know, like I created this emotional reaction in somebody who I don't even know, and they don't even know me. I would think with television, and this is just me guessing, having collaborated on some things, you know, the difference in control is obviously profound, you
Yes.
know, but I know when you're, you know, for me, when I'm writing a novel, sometimes there's just that feeling of, I wish I could think of a better way to end this, or I wish I could, you know, knowing that there are better ways and knowing if you had the right people around you, those would come out. But also likewise, knowing that, you know, you have a great idea that then maybe it gets watered down or you get show notes from the producers or the network. And then like, this is not my vision at all.
Right. Well, the other difference is when I write a novel, I'm trying to do the best version of it right up until the moment that it's published, until the very last moment. And I'm into it right to the very end. Well, with television or movies, you got to let go at some point. You got to hand it over to the location scout, to the casting agent, to the director, to the actor, to the executives, and that's under the best of all possible circumstances. Whereas if you're writing a novel at the last minute, if you decide the scene in the bowling alley should be set at St. Patrick's Cathedral, you can do it. You can do it. The only thing that's keeping you from doing it is your own lack of nerve and your own laziness in some cases, where you go, oh, I already did it this way, so I don't want to do it over again. Well, that's not an excuse that you should allow to get in the way.
Right. Or your editor reminding you that there's no bowling alley, in fact, inside St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Well, there's that as well. But wouldn't it be great if there was?
But it's amazing to me, and maybe not to diverge too much into TV, but I'm a big consumer of shows, and I have such appreciation when the writing is good, which I think is more rare than not. And you kind of wonder, like, how, you know, you've got all these great writers, but you have to understand the machinations of that process. But when you see shows like Fargo or Succession, and you're like, the writer's room must be phenomenal. Like they must be having such a great time because something is working so profoundly, versus other times when you're like, oh, this is trope after trope.
Yes.
How do you have 10 people in a writer's room and you keep coming up with this? Do you run into those different can you feel a different energy when things are just clicking?
Yes, and I've worked in for several different shows. I've worked for a bunch of Law and Order shows. I've worked for Blue Bloods as well. I've worked on projects that I initiated as well. And there's a cliche in writing that the King James Bible is the only good thing ever written by committee.
And even that, there's a lot of conflicting stories in there.
There's some places where that doesn't come together completely. But there are times, yes, when, as you say, you're hearing other people's ideas and it really makes you pick it up a notch. And that's the best of all circumstances. And again, I'm working with some great people right now. There are other cases where you're really working in a format that's well established, and really you're filling out that format week after week. And it's
Law and Order is a great example of that, I would say.
Yeah, and that's what people like about it.
Right. Me too. I love the Law and Order.
Right. There's a certain comfort food aspect to it, and I get it, and I appreciate it. But when I'm writing a novel, I'm really like trying to connect with you in a completely different kind of way.
Yeah, you're in full control of the universe, whether people are going to enjoy that or not. And so
Yeah.
you said, so obviously you started writing young. You mentioned the age 13. Where do
Yeah.
you think that drive and that interest came from?
I remember the moment when I
I
decided
love when
that.
you remember when people remember the moment.
Yeah, it was Mother's Day when I was 13 years old, and I'd had a little job at a shoe store, and I'd saved some money to buy my mother a present. I grew up in New York City. I went into a store called Gimbel's,
No,
uh,
yeah.
and as I stood at the counter, counting my dollars to see if I had enough to buy my mother a tiny bottle of perfume, I looked around and there was a little girl standing nearby with her nanny. The little girl was about 4 years old, and she started to pull down her underwear in the middle of the store.
Jesus.
And the nanny turned to her and said, "Stop that! You're as bad as your mother." And
You're like, you can't write this stuff.
I was like, I got to tell somebody this story. This is
That's, I mean, that's like right out of Mad Men.
yeah, yeah. I just found myself as I was growing up having more and more moments and observations like that I not only wanted to share with people, but that led me to want to imagine, hey, what was the mother like? That led.
Right. Well,
What's
I
the
think it's
back?
pretty clear, crystal clear based on those 3 seconds. What the
Right, but then that introduces what? Okay, so what was her relationship with the nanny like? What
right,
was the household like?
right.
Okay, that becomes a little short story in and of itself when you start to imagine things like that. And I just started to go with that. And the other thing that happened was I grew up in the city in the 1970s, which was a tough time. But there were two great newspaper columnists at the time who wrote for the Daily News and earlier for the New York Post. One was named Jimmy Breslin, and the other was a guy named Pete Hamill. And they would write 3 times a week. And each column was about 750 words. And sometimes it was often news, sometimes it'd be about sports, and sometimes it was just like a short story about real people. And sometimes very ordinary people. Breslin is very famous for one particular column he wrote in November 1963. Everybody else was writing about the Kennedy assassination and the grassy knoll and all that. He found the guy who was actually digging Kennedy's grave and wrote a beautiful column about that guy.
Right.
And just seeing the way those guys used language, their conciseness, their control, their compassion for the people that they were writing about was really inspiring for me. And then I actually got a job working for Pete Hamill as his assistant. And he was a fantastic guy. And the very first time I had lunch with him, he taught me 3 lessons about writing that have served me well for the 45 years since then that I've been at it. One was that if you have an experience and you think there's any chance you're going to write about it, write down every aspect of that experience within 24 hours, or you will not have the detail that you will need in 6 years or 16 years if you're trying to render the scene the way you need to.
Yeah, that's very true.
That was brilliant. The other thing was always read writers who are better than you, because you can't learn anything from somebody who's worse than you, and you probably can't learn that much from somebody who's right at your level. Right. So always try and aim a little bit higher. And the third thing he said is that if you're talking to somebody, this serves for research purposes, but it's true in a lot of areas. And a question occurs to you and it makes you uncomfortable to think about asking that question, you must find a way to ask that question.
Because that's the question to ask.
Yeah, because that's the question to ask. And sometimes the answer is get the hell out of my office.
Right.
But much more often, the answer is I've been waiting for you to ask that. And it's the beginning of a whole other conversation.
Nobody asked me that question.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I've been
Yeah, and
waiting.
that's what becomes interesting. Those are all great lessons for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, they make a lot of sense. So did you go to college, or did you just go straight to working for
Yeah.
Peter and starting to write?
Well, at one point I said I was going to college, but at one point I said to him, I think I should just quit and educate
Mhm.
myself by becoming a journalist. He said, "Nah, you can't do that. It's the beginning of the 1980s. You actually do need a college degree."
Yeah,
But after I got to college, I became a journalist. But I became a journalist so I could be a novelist
interesting.
because I wanted to not be a one book wonder. And not that
Right,
my first book would necessarily do that well. I wanted to be able to write about all kinds of things, connect them to, my own emotional life. But the only way to do that was to have an excuse to knock on people's doors, come inside, sit on their couches, and hear their stories,
right,
and
right,
get out of my own life story in
right.
some my own point of view.
Yeah, and I've talked to a lot of authors, a lot of novelists who their career was journalism, and it's such an education, not only in terms of learning how to write and to storytell and convey a message, but how to do it in such a succinct and powerful fashion, how to distill those sentences into something more potent, by cutting half of them away. And I think that's a tremendous skill to have. So when you started to write long form, you did that education assist you, or were you like, "Oh my god, I've got a lot of pages to fill here?"
No, it was a little bit of both. I remember the editor I used to have at New York Magazine, Ed Kozner, would sometimes write MEGO, MEGO, on my copy, which meant my eyes glaze over. So that taught me to get to the point quickly. But then when I started writing my first novel, um, there was a transition to be made. I mean, in journalism, you learn the inverted pyramid. You learn to say who, what, when, why right away. Well, that doesn't really work in writing fiction or in um, a kind of storytelling in which the reader really wants to be transported
Right,
somewhere else. So you really learn to take your time in that process and to seduce the reader into taking their time to enter the world
right.
that you're creating. And it's a much deeper, more involved process. At least for me, it is because it takes me so long to write these books. Uh,
Me
I
too.
really need to immerse myself in order to do that. So the first book that I wrote, when I was a journalist, I decided I needed to find a job that would be the source of the book's character, plot, tone, texture, everything. I eventually decided to write about being a probation officer
Hmm.
because it was 1988. It's a job that splits the difference between being a social worker and being a cop. And you were
Mhm,
dealing with a real cross section of humanity because it was both violent criminals and also white collar criminals.
mhm,
And you're supposed to be both their father confessor and the hammer who
mhm,
punishes
mhm.
them when they screw up. And in order to really write about that realistically, I took a leave of absence from New York Magazine and I became a volunteer probation officer so I
Hmm,
could have day to day experience and create the core of that experience inside myself. So
mhm.
it wouldn't just be, kind of a collection of a bunch of facts,
Right,
or
right. It's like
observation.
being a method actor in a way.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And then there's still, after all that research, was a sense of like, well, what's this book about? What's the feeling behind this? What's I can come up with a story, but what's it really about? And then I remember one day I was out with the warrant squad and I was outside a housing project in a van with a bunch of the officers. One of the female officers turned to me and said, "You start off wanting to help these people. You start off wanting to change their lives, and then they don't change, and you start to hate them."
Hmm.
And that's real. That's what real people think. It's dark, but it's something that I haven't read about that often in a book. Certainly not something that I saw in a lot of Disney movies.
Right, because the conceit of nearly every novel, or the cliche of the conceit, is that there's an arc to the characters, and they do change, and they do find that redemption, and the idea that they don't is depressing to people, even if it is real.
Yeah, but I found something fascinating about I'm going to try and write a story that includes that reality,
right,
in a way. And so I look, without being depressing, and certainly the last book that I wrote was I don't think was depressing. It wasn't depressing for me at all. Trying to have that authentic feeling, that authentic emotion be part of the story, because I can't buy into it unless I have that, and I'm not going to ask the reader to buy into a story that I don't believe in myself.
right, because, and what's so fascinating is that message alone, as stark as it is, actually speaks volumes to the probation officer themselves, because they are still trying. They see it
Right.
time and time again, but they are still trying, and that's definitely a hopeful message.
Yeah,
Even though
sure.
they're like getting ground down.
Yeah.
And it's, you talk about immersion in a world when you're writing a novel, and that's absolutely true. And it's so hard, I think, as the author, to judge, how long does it take to immerse? Like, am I doing this well? I have no idea. I don't know until I share it with somebody after it's well completed. Like, am I even close? After 10 novels, I'm like, I have no idea.
Well, I just published a book that I worked on for 20 years.
Oh boy.
I started writing it in 2002, March 27th, 2002, and I just published it last year. And today it came out in paperback, Picture in the Sand.
Congratulations.
And that went through every kind of iteration you can possibly imagine. It started off because it was the first spring holiday after the 9/11 attacks in New York. And the 10 Commandments was on, as it always is on television around that holiday season. And for the first time, I caught it from the beginning, because everybody was milling around before dinner. And there's Charlton Heston in the credits, and there's Yul Brynner. And then it says the Pharaoh's army is played by the Egyptian Cavalry Corps. I was like, wow, I hadn't realized it was shot in Egypt.
Right. You thought it was all a big sound stage.
Yeah. I mean, like the parting of the Red Sea was done on a sound stage. But I thought, wait a second. This movie came out in 1956. It's such an extravagant production. They must have been in Egypt like in 1954. Well, I knew from all the stuff going on around 9/11 that 1954 in Egypt is where the whole philosophy behind Al-Qaeda and that kind of radical fundamentalism started. Right then, there was a guy named Saeed Qutb, who was the intellectual vanguard of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's when he was like, we've got to keep out the West. We've got to keep out America. This stuff is bad. I realized he was around and he was fomenting this philosophy at the exact same time that the most extravagant production in Hollywood history is a few miles away in the desert.
The antithesis of his belief system was in his backyard.
I thought it'll be a cinch to write a novel about this. And then it took me 20 years, and I went to Egypt 6 times. I went to Hollywood twice as many times. I interviewed 200 people who'd been involved in the politics of that day and directly involved in the movie and all that. And I wrote the book over and over and over and over again. And at one point, it was rejected by almost every single publisher you can possibly think of. I think it was rejected by people who it wasn't even submitted to. It was probably like
preemptively rejecting the novel.
Yeah. Just in case you were thinking of submitting this. But I didn't give up because I knew there was something there. That there was something on the other side of the brick wall that I needed to get to. And it was really during the pandemic when I couldn't do the kind of research that I normally do, which is, going to be a probation officer or visiting the tunnels underneath Riverside Park where homeless people live. I couldn't do any of that stuff during the pandemic. And I thought, I want to give this book one more try. And I had a different way to write the book, completely, which is I took a character who had been a secondary character. It's a young Egyptian guy who becomes Cecil B. DeMille's assistant on the film and thinks he's going to move to California and change his name to Al Harrison and get a house in Pasadena and buy a Plymouth and all that stuff. And instead he gets sucked into the Muslim Brotherhood and a real life terror plot that actually took place at the time. And it becomes that kind of story instead. And then I decided he should be telling the story as an old man, looking back on the events of 1954, and he should be telling it to his grandson, who has just run off to join ISIS instead of going to college in the United States. And so it becomes a kind of epistolary novel, but through emails where the old man is telling the story that's been a secret for basically 50 years to the kid who's about to go off and make the exact same mistakes. And that was the thing that made the book actually start to work. And that version of the book did get accepted by a major publisher, and that's the book Picture in the Sand that's out now. But the thing is that there was no shortcut to get there. I had to put in the 20 years. I had to have the investment of time. People talk a lot about AI and the role of AI in writing. Well, AI can't spare you all the failures.
Right.
That were necessary to get to that story.
Right. Even if you choose to define them as failures. I mean, maybe all of that not selling the book was necessary to get the book to where it needed to be as just a work of art, as opposed to something that was commercially viable. I'm curious to know in the rejections you went through with that, because you did so much research and because you traveled for it, and with your journalistic background, did any of those publishers ever suggest you write it as a nonfiction piece?
Only very fleetingly and never in a very serious way.
Because what an amazing, even as a nonfiction piece, what an amazing story.
It was, but it's still, I think, I started writing it in 2002. And when I started writing it, people still knew in the larger popular culture who Cecil B. DeMille was. People still remember.
Yeah, that's true.
Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the prime minister of Egypt. Back then. Well, those names by 2020, say, had begun to fade into history a little bit. And I had to have another reason for people to need to read the book. It had to become an emotional story. It had to work at the level of characters that people could identify with in some way.
And I wonder if there was also something about just needing more time from 9/11, because there was a lot of popular culture around terrorism. But then there was also kind of, it's kind of like writing about the pandemic. And some people are like, it's just in my face every day. I don't want to, I don't want to see it anymore. And then probably 10 years from now, you're going to see probably novels that are flourished about the pandemic because people have had a chance to breathe from it.
Well, it's hard to tell what's going to be the interesting parts and what are the parts that are lasting or the parts are not lasting. That is tricky. I mean, again, that goes back to the piece of advice that Hamill gave me, which is I needed to write everything down close to the time it happened so that the raw feeling was captured somewhere. But that didn't mean that I understood the right context to put it in until many years later.
Right. And I think it kind of speaks to your tenacity as a writer, because my first 3 novels didn't sell. And then I was like, all right, well, that's because I suck. It totally makes sense that they don't sell. So I'll just keep going on. One of them, I went back and I'm like, I really like this book. And I rewrote it several times. And then we ended up just not even submitting anymore. We just were like, let's just let it go. And that's a hard thing to do. And clearly you see in that particular book, like, this is really an interesting story. And it's almost like the story's great. I didn't write it great. Let me keep trying to get better until I'm mature enough to do it the way that it needs to be told.
Yes, that's exactly what the issue was with my book. There was a story there, but I hadn't figured out the right way to tell that story. All of the events were pretty much the same in the book for a long period of time, but it was just not the right voice. It wasn't giving you that Scheherazade sense of like somebody taking you by the hand. and saying, now I'm going to tell you something that you don't know.
Right.
I'm going to take you to a place you haven't been before,
Right.
which is
Right.
what the reader really wants, I think.
And so, and talking about your book, The Intruder, which I think originally came out in
Yeah.
96,
Yes.
obviously to great success. I'm just curious, now it's resuscitated. I mean, maybe that's not the right word for it, but it's been a while.
It was mouth to mouth. Yeah, sure.
And so I'm just so fascinated by the idea of a re-release. What was the thought process behind that? Did they approach you? What was just that general kind of thinking behind re-releasing it?
Well, I mean, it all starts with the story, and does
Right.
just the same as with Picture in the Sand. Does an old story still speak to people today? Does it have anything to say to contemporary readers that make any sense? And that book, again, I know exactly the moment that book was born. That book was born 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, when I had a 1-year-old child. He was in a stroller. I was pushing him up Broadway at a time that the city was swarmed by homeless people struggling with mental illness. It was 7 o'clock in the morning in February. My wife said, just get this crying baby out of the house. And I passed a doorway on Broadway where there were a bunch of guys hanging out. And one of them stepped out of the doorway, cocked back his fist, and said, call the police on me now. And my hands were down on the stroller handle, so I had no way to protect myself and no way to protect my son if he had actually thrown the punch at that moment. And I was filled with this scalding rage that I had never experienced before.
Because you went into protective mode as a father.
Yeah. And then he dropped his fist and he laughed. And I pushed the stroller away. And I thought, I was really ready to go after this guy.
So this guy was just randomly thought it would be a funny thing to just do that.
Yeah, he looked like listen, he was someone who looked like he was just off Rikers Island. He was that was the vibe, and
wow.
He was messing with me. And I thought, I'm so mad. That feeling, that emotion is powerful enough to be something I want to write a book about. Or it's enough to carry me through a narrative. But then by the time I got to the corner and the light, literally, it turned red, I thought, is it really enough? There've been, stories like people still remember Death Wish or Charles Bronson or Straw Dogs.
Right.
Just about
vigilantism.
And vigilantism. It was only a few years after the Bernard Goetz incident in New York. I thought that isn't enough of a story.
Right.
At least it's not for the kind of book that I want to write. What if part of this story was also from the homeless guy's point of view? What if some of it was like, how did that guy end up in the doorway? And why did he do that? And I thought, Stephen King, who knows a thing or two about writing, said, what a novel needs is a sense of two opposing ideas coming together. And here I had two very opposing ideas coming together. The stakeholder in society with a child and someone who's completely on the margins of society colliding. I thought, well, okay, the friction between those two things, that's enough for a book. So that's what that book was about. It's a homeless guy who stalks a middle-class family who he feels have stolen the life he was meant to have. And then halfway through, the story reverses in a way that I hope you don't see coming. I thought that book and Slow Motion Riot, the first book I talked about the probation officer, were period pieces about a time in the city and a time in many cities that had gone by. That it was about the late 80s and the 90s, and that was a period that was historical at this point. Well, a lot of those same issues have reemerged in the last few years. We're really feeling the effects of that inequality, really feeling that we're living in two worlds that coexist side by side, and feeling the tension between the haves and the have-nots. So the book began to feel very of the moment once again. Right at that same time, my good friend Jeremy Wagner, who is a musician and a writer himself, Jeremy has a band called Broken Hope. He also writes very vivid horror novels, decided that he would start a publishing house called Dead Sky Publishing.
Yeah.
And they're doing some very exciting things. And Jeremy asked me if I'd be interested in bringing The Intruder back into the world. And it had been in print, and it had been in available in audio versions and digital versions, but not in any kind of appreciable way. And I asked a number of other people because, you want to hear other people's opinions of whether this book still has any vitality.
Mm-hmm.
And the feedback that I got was, yes, it definitely does. And it does deserve to be out there in the world again, wandering the streets and getting into trouble.
Still set back in the 90s.
Yeah. I didn't rewrite the book or anything. This is the book. It has a new introduction. Talking about how I see the world has changed and then gone back to the way it was in some ways. But essentially, this is the very same book that came out in 1980.
And it's a different perspective now because, when you see, so I've got a book coming out in 2 weeks that's set in 87. And, there's this kind of desire for books set 2-3 decades ago, because it's so much more interesting. I think it's so much more interesting because you're so limited in what a character is able to do, because of the lack of technology. I think so your book, I'm sure, looks the same and totally different at the same time to a new generation.
Getting rid of cell phones, boy, does that help storytelling.
Oh, I love it because when you're going to go meet a friend and they don't show up and you're out in the middle of nowhere, and you don't know what's happening. You don't have GPS. You don't have a way to and I mean, it's if you're a thriller writer like me, it's a playground.
But people staring into computer screens, I think, is the death of drama, the death of storytelling. So completely. I'll do anything I can to avoid it. I mean, without being unrealistic about it.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. And I think it's worth mentioning, before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit. So I interviewed your wife just a few weeks ago, or about a month ago.
Peg Tire.
Peg Tire. And we had a fantastic conversation. And I guess I didn't realize that until I was kind of doing a little bit more research about you. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm talking to Peter.
That's who kicked me out of the apartment with the crying baby.
That's what I figured.
And so we got a book out of it, so it's okay as well another kid.
So you have obviously been together for some time, and I'm always curious about couples who are both authors. My observation is that tends to be a very strong and healthy dynamic. I can't picture it. I think that would be, because I don't want to show my work to anybody until I'm all done. And do you have a collaborative literary relationship, or you just kind of do your own thing?
Well, Peg Tire is my wife, and she has a very, very strong professional identity and a very strong point of view. She's written a couple of crime novels, Strangers in the Night and The Midnight Hour, both great, both reflecting on her years as a newspaper reporter, but she's also had a very serious career as an education journalist since then. She wrote a bestseller called The Trouble with Boys.
That's what we discussed on her episode.
And the good school, and she's a very revered figure, not only in our household but also in the larger education world. And it's great because we sort of both come to things from our own realms, and that brings its own kind of energy to the relationship. So having your own independent identity can be a really healthy, good thing. I read not long ago that the guys in ZZ Top stayed together as the original trio for many years until one of them died, I think last year. Part of the reason why is that they spent the money to have 3 separate tour buses. And so
that's so
they were
interesting.
on the
Not that they
road.
hated each other, but they needed that space.
Yeah. And Billy Gibbons said, so that when we got to wherever we were going, we were glad to see each other again.
Right.
Instead of going,
that's
man, I've been breathing in gas fumes with this guy for 9 hours. I can't stand him. So I thought that was a really healthy perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Well, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to get to the storytelling, the making it up part of the show, if you're up for it, where you're going to choose a book on the wall behind me, and we're going to pick a random page. I'm going to pick a random sentence. I'm going to read that sentence, and that's the first sentence and maybe a 2-minute long short story. So I'll read that sentence. You give me the next sentence or two. I'll do a sentence or two, and then I'll shoot it in the head before it gets terrible.
Okay.
So choose, give me a color of a book, and
I see a red book behind you.
Okay, let me I will choose a red book. Let's see. I'll go this is Grisham's The Rainmaker.
Okay.
Boy, I bought this from I can tell from the sticker from Borders, back when Borders was a thing. It's kind of depressing. Give me a page between 1 and 600.
All right. Page 48.
Okay. And I'm just going to quickly scan page 48 for a sentence. All right. I'm just going to read this sentence, and you do whatever you want with it for a sentence or two, and then I'll go. The lobby is empty as I enter it from a door near the elevators.
He put the book down and said, no, that's no damn good. Grisham already wrote it. Instead, he slid open the desk drawer and took out the 38. It was already loaded. Now he'd have something to write about.
Write what you know. That's what his wife always said to him. And he always thought it was a ridiculous idea. Never giving people credit for their imaginations. But today he decided to take her advice. I'm going to do a little research.
She caught him in the hallway. You're not really going to do this, she said. It's my last chance, he replied, shutting the door behind him. He felt around in his pocket for the car keys, got behind the wheel of the secondhand Peugeot, and gunned the motor.
He knew he didn't have far to go, really just 10 minutes, the same trip he took 5 days a week for the last 30 years. When he pulled into the parking lot of the insurance company he worked for, he got out and opened the door. He knew Chris would be working today. That's all that mattered.
Right. How you doing, buddy? Chris greeted him at the door.
I think we call it there. I think we just let it like suspend Billy.
Okay. How did I do?
You did great. That's so funny because I used to think like I'm not big into research. I research obviously when I need to, but I don't predicate my books on research. But the idea of like an author, especially a horror writer, being like, I really got to get. I feel like I'm not getting this authentic enough. I really need to know what a person sounds like when they're being tortured, for example.
Right.
And then they're going to the lengths to do that. I always thought that was a fascinating idea of like somebody slipping into that other realm for the sheer authenticity of the writing. Yeah. I always thought that would make an interesting story.
Absolutely.
So that was good. Well, listen, what a pleasure to meet you, and congratulations on your paperback release today, and then the re-release of The Intruder. Sounds like, and I'll be eager to see the fruitions of the show that you're working on as well. So you are a busy man, Peter.
Thank you so much, Carter.
Take care. Thanks very much. All right. So that is it. That was my conversation with Peter Blauner. Really interesting. I loved hearing about, the fact that his wife is also a well-known author, and you know how they come at things with two very distinct viewpoints, and he had a fantastic ZZ Top analogy in there as well. The Intruder has just been re-released, so please check that out. You can read about The Intruder and everything about Peter if you just hop on over to his website, which is peterblauner.com. And please feel free to go over to my website, carterwilson.com, where you can read about my event dates, my books. You can buy my books, sign up for my newsletter, and link over to unboundwriter.com as well if you want to hear about my offerings in terms of writing retreats, one-on-one coaches, and soon we'll be offering online classes as well. So that's it for now, folks. I appreciate, as always, you watching and or listening to this episode. More episodes will be out next week. In the meantime, take care.